What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content that I'm uploading onto my channel, then feel free to subscribe, and you can also offer suggestions on topics and characters and storylines and whatnot that we can have discussions on later on in this channel.
Okay, we're here. We are here. We find out what happens to Negan. I'm so excited. I'm so excited to talk to you guys about this because, God, can we all just agree? All right, can we sit down, Rob Core? People who are new to Comics Explained, hit the subscribe button to become part of Comics Explained. Can we sit down and say that Jeffrey Dean Morgan is like the perfect Negan? Like no one could play Negan better than him. Jeffrey Dean Morgan, I love you, man. You are my main man. Like you are, you're amazing as Negan. Also, remember guys, remember the rule. If Daryl dies, we riot, which raises a good point. In all seriousness, a lot of people have been asking the question, does Daryl exist in the comic books? No, Daryl does not exist in the comics. Robert Kirkman said that the whole idea of the TV show, or at least one of the ideas of the TV show, was to correct a lot of the things that he thought were mistakes in the comics. That's one of the reasons why Rick hasn't lost his hand yet, or at least that seems to be the reason why Rick hasn't lost his hand in the TV show, is because Kirkman regrets doing that with his character. That may happen at some point in time, but for right now, that seems to be the reason why. The other half of this is that I'm actually kind of glad Daryl's not in the comics. I like what they did with Carol, where they kind of reshuffled her and made her the TV show equivalent to Andrea in a lot of ways. I like that, you know, Daryl is a TV show creation because it adds a new dynamic to the show. It really shows how great things are when you don't copy the comics directly and you add a few little tidbits here and there to allow it to stand out. But without further ado, because I know you guys don't care about my ramblings, let's get into this. So in the last video, we had talked about how the Saviors had basically gone to war with Rick's group. I mean, it was a kind of a mutual thing where Rick had gone to war with the Saviors and the Saviors had gone to war with him. And it seemed like they were winning. They had basically, brought in a zombie horde to go against Negan and his forces, but while Rick and them had basically retreated and regrouped, Negan did the exact same thing, but they also fought their way through the zombie horde. And so when they showed up on the doorstep of Alexandria, Rick wasn't really expecting it. It kind of took him by surprise, and it turned the tide of battle in favor of Negan when they basically just started pillaging the Alexandria safe zone and burning down a lot of the houses and so on. And so what this does is it continues with that. Now again, because of the fact that the hilltop, which we'll actually see in this week's episode, so you guys should be able to relate to this, because the hilltop was being ran by Gregory, who was a guy, for all intents and purposes, willing to lay down in front of Negan and just kind of let Negan walk all over him. Because Maggie had basically risen up and kind of cast, Gregory out as the leader, a lot of people looked to her as the leader, and she had led the forces, of the hilltop to Alexandria in order to assist in the effort of helping, fight off the Saviors and the forces of Negan. Initially, it was believed it would be this sort of last stand, but instead that last stand actually happens here. But, in the fallout, things are kind of panicky in the sense that you've got Maggie and you've got Eugene and a few other people taking refuge in a building just on the outside of the safe zone. And initially, the idea of one of the unnamed members of their group is, okay, let's go outside and let's see if we can't, see where, let's see what we can see. Let's see if things have died down, because at this point the gunfire is all pretty much subsided, and so it seems pretty quiet. It's one of those all quiet on the Western Front sort of things. But as soon as he opens the front door, there's just a herd of zombies that immediately come pouring in. Now at this point it's panic mode, because you've got Negan on one side, at least it's presumed you got Negan on one side, you got zombies on the other side, and it's like Maggie and Eugene don't see a way out. But as soon as they escape, of course they run into Negan. Now Eugene, remember, is an extremely important part of this, because he's the guy that's making ammunition for the forces of Rick Grimes, and so to lose him is to lose a major piece on this board. I wouldn't say that Rick Grimes is losing a queen, but I would certainly say he's losing a rook or he's losing a bishop. It's a pretty significant power play here by Negan to grab Eugene and to basically take him prisoner. And so from here, we switch over to Rick. Now again, a lot of this is just fallout, and Rick's been unconscious for the last hour after having a concussion when Negan invaded and set off the explosions and so on. And so the funny thing about this though is that Negan's actions, whether it was direct or indirect, have put Rick Grimes in a very tough situation. And the reason I say this is Rick Grimes basically had two doctors at his disposal. He had Dr. Carson in the hilltop, and he had Denise in the Alexandria safe zone. The problem is that Denise was the first one to be bitten by a zombie in the attack of Negan. And the result is that Rick doesn't have Denise at his disposal anymore because she's dying of a zombie infection. So all he has is Dr. Carson, which means that at this moment right now, Dr. Carson's playing double duty. He's being a doctor in the hilltop and he's being a doctor here. Now, of course, his attention's being drawn here just because he's what amounts to a field medic in the midst of a conflict. But at this point, Rick's basically learning confirming everything that's going on. And so we switch over to Heath and Denise. Now remember, Heath is in a relationship with Denise right now. And so for Heath, it's not just losing an average, like losing the doctor, it's losing a person he's in love with. And the idea here is that he has to find a way to cope. Heath has to find a way to get around this. The other half of this equation is that Denise herself is really concerned and wanting to make sure that, Heath is okay. But it's Rick trying to come to grips with the fact that they're down one of their most important people. And so immediately the idea is, what do we do next? Because remember, everybody looks to Rick Grimes as the leader, and Rick says, we have to survey the damage. He has to understand what's going on. And so getting back outside, looking at the safe zone, we're basically told that the invasion of Negan had led to the destruction of, a multitude of houses in Alexandria. Now, a lot of them were confined to the outskirts, but the issue here is that a lot of those houses were vacant, which means that those individuals who could possibly show up, those individuals who may be looking to come to Alexandria from the hilltop, don't have a place to stay. Not only that, the place is a war zone. And so Rick says, look, we're not going to stay here, especially because I think it was Nicholas, went to him, just one of the average guys went to him and said, look, I've got to go. I can't stay here. I've got to get my family to the hilltop where it's safe. And Rick says, yeah, we're all going to do that. Like we're all heading out. Now, initially, Ezekiel wasn't necessarily on board with this. Ezekiel being the head of the kingdom looks out for his people first because of course he's their leader. He has to make sure, has to ensure their well-being, especially after the conversation he had with Michonne, where she had basically called him a coward because of the fact that he wasn't sure if he wanted to fight or not. But for Ezekiel, his idea is, we don't want to stay here any longer than we have to. We're effectively going to bail out. We're going back to the kingdom. Now, Rick says, hey man, don't do this. We're stronger together than we are apart. And even if you decide to go back to the kingdom, at least follow us to the hilltop. That way we'll have safety in numbers and we don't have to worry about Negan being able to attack two different groups and taking us out due to the divided nature in terms of both of them going in two different locations. And so following this, we basically have, Jesus running up on Rick and saying, hey man, they took Eugene. And this is when Rick really begins to realize how dire things are getting, because now they only have a finite source of ammunition. Granted, Eugene wouldn't be able to make enough ammunition to compensate for the ammo they were going through in the midst of this conflict, but his presence would mean that once they went into a lull period, like they are right now, he could begin creating more ammunition for the upcoming conflict. The issue is that with Eugene gone, they now basically just kind of have to rely on what they have in order to get them through this conflict. Now, of course, switching back to Heath, this is really just Denise reanimating as a zombie, and of course, Michonne is the one who puts Denise down. Now, this isn't a huge deal. This is really just Kirkman saying, hey man, everybody's dealing with this in their own way. Everybody's coping with things as best they can. But something else that Kirkman does is he really sets the stage for this being the dawn of a new era, in the sense that we have Rick Grimes more or less looking at the phone that he used to use. Now, the phone is very similar to what you all saw in the TV show, in the sense that following the death of Lori, Rick Grimes kind of started going insane, and he began to hear her voice on the other side of the phone. Now, this was half of him losing his mind and half of him mourning her death. But the idea was that for us as the reader, it looked like Rick was having a psychotic break, which in a lot of ways he was. But the idea here is that he basically leaves it behind. He says, this is me essentially starting over. This is me walking away from everything before and beginning a new chapter. And so they essentially bail out and they all head out to their new location. Now from here, we jump forward to Eugene. Now, this is really just kind of Kirkman just showing us a continuation. This isn't an absolutely necessary thing, but it is Kirkman saying, hey, look, man, this is really just Negan threatening Eugene, saying, hey, you're going to make weapons for us. You're going to give us weapons. And if you don't, I'm going to kill all of your friends. Now, this is also Kirkman telling us how far Eugene has come, because when we were first introduced to the character of Eugene, he was a coward by almost all standard of measurement. I mean, he was one of the worst people to have on your side, in the sense that he was lying about being in touch with Congress. He would never really engage in any real measure of conflict. He'd always just run and hide. But right now, he's actually pretty badass. He's pretty hardcore. He tells Negan, look, no, I'm not going to make any weapons for you. You can torture me all you want to. You can threaten me all you want to, but it's not going to happen. And so ultimately Negan basically leaves, Eugene to contemplate his fate. And then suddenly we have the return of Dwight. Now keep in mind, for those of you guys who are new to the story up to this point, Dwight is the inside man for Rick Grimes. Dwight was the first one to turncoat on Negan and to basically say, I'll help you guys from the inside out. Now keep in mind, Dwight can't do anything overt. If Dwight were to try to kill Negan, for example, it would give away, the fact that Dwight is effectively turned on Negan. Not only that, it may not be successful. In addition to this is also a scenario where Negan has to be publicly defeated, because if Negan were to simply just die, then maybe somebody worse than Negan among their ranks would join up or would take over his place, because there are people within the Saviors who are worse than Negan. The issue is that they're not wildly intelligent when it comes to leading people. And that's one of the reasons why Negan took hold as the guy who was in charge of everything. But from here, it's really just Dwight trying to convince Eugene to say, hey, look, man, I'm on your side. Yes, there are things that I cannot do. Yes, it would be easy to just kill Negan in his sleep, but I can't do that because it would give away my position. Plus, I'm relying on information from Rick, and Rick is really the one directing me on what it is that I should and should not do. But in the middle of this, we suddenly have Dwight met with the arrival of Carson. Now, in order to make sure that we don't get confused, Dr. Carson is a character we'll just refer to as Dr. Carson. Carson, we'll just call him by his name Harlan, because I think it'd be a lot easier to differentiate between the two. But Harlan is really just, again, one of the saviors, but he also shows us that not everyone who's among Negan's ranks agrees with what he's doing. That Harlan is among other people who want to break away from Negan, and we're just looking for the chance to do it. Now, this is also kind of a kicker here, because the question is, well, if they wanted to get away from Negan, then why didn't they just do it on their own? Why didn't they simply just run away? And it was really one of these things where it begs the question of, is Harlan a coward? Is he waiting for someone to save him from Negan as opposed to saving himself from Negan, or is he just playing it smart? This is really how Robert Kirkman writes these characters, and he just kind of leaves it to us to decide. Is a person who waits for the right time to do something an intelligent person, or are they a coward for not doing it sooner? It really is just kind of a question on what direction you take in terms of how you perceive them. But it's really just Harlan saying, hey, look, Dwight, there are other people that want to leave. I've overheard everything you said. I will help you guys get out of here. And so from this point, we switch over to Brianna and Maggie. And this is really Brianna just kind of solidifying that Maggie is the de facto leader of the Hilltop. Now, Maggie doesn't want to be the leader of the Hilltop, and this actually creates a really interesting scenario when it comes to being a leader. One of the issues that Maggie's going to run into here is the idea of ensuring everybody has supplies. Because when you're the leader, people will cozy up to you and make sure they get the best stuff. Not only that, people who were friends before you became a leader will expect special treatment. Maggie doesn't want to be put in this situation. Maggie doesn't want to have to look at a woman who has a child and say, you get just as much food as a person who doesn't have a child. Because if what you do is you come along and you say, well, they have a child so they get more, and the person who doesn't have a child gets less, well, then it's you start making decisions, and then you start inciting violence among people. And so the idea is she's trying to find a perfect middle ground. Now, in truth, you can't really take that stance. You just got to stand up to the guy who's pissed off because he gets less and say, sorry about your luck. She's got a kid, you don't, you get less. That's just the way it is. If you don't like it, you can leave. That's really the stance that you have to take here. But for Maggie, she doesn't want to get caught up in that situation, because when you're leader, you're always going to run into a scenario where there's going to be those that hate you and those that like you. The ones that like you are the ones that get what they want. The ones that hate you are the ones that don't or feel like they're cheated. And you'll find both. The ones that like you will eventually hate you, and the ones that hate you will eventually like you. It's based on the situation. And so Maggie doesn't want to be caught up in this cat and mouse game of being perceived as a terrible person and a great person. But the truth is that, from Brianna's perspective and everybody else in the Hilltop, Maggie is the leader, because Maggie was the one that cast out Gregory. Maggie was the one that led them all into a conflict with the saviors on the side of Rick Grimes, and Maggie was the one that said we have to trust Rick Grimes. So whether Maggie wants it or not, she's the leader of everybody in the Hilltop, and she has to accept that role. And so at this point, we really pick up with Rick analyzing the situation. We pick up with Rick really trying to figure things out in terms of what direction they go to from here, because in his mind, Negan is going to counterattack. Negan is going to come back. And the idea is like, okay, we basically need to muster a defense before we get too far into that. Now, in truth, Rick is really having just as much of a conversation with Andrea as he is, I guess about this topic, as he is mulling it over on his own, because the two of them are very close, and Andrea will always be in his corner in the sense of making sure that he's making a rational decision, and she'll tell him if he's being stupid, which works out really, really well for his decision-making thing. But it's also other people from the kingdom, really just kind of rallying under this one point. So they have sheer force of numbers. And so, as Rick is talking to Ezekiel, he says, okay, look, here's what we need to do. According to Jesus, there is this small little area, a few shops and maybe a couple, houses or something like that are just outside. They're just outside this area. We need to take our vulnerable and put them there out of harm's way where Negan doesn't know where they're located, and the only ones who stay here are the most capable. And the only thing we can really hope for is that because it'll take a day to happen, that Negan and his forces will arrive here in the next couple days. They won't immediately counterattack. Now, as for Negan himself, this is really, I'm kind of taking this out of order here, but as for Negan himself, this is one of the ways in which he's extremely capable as a leader. This is one of the things that I really didn't expect. What he does is he has, of course, a whole bunch of zombies chained up, and he's talking to his guys, and he says, we know how things work. We know that when you die, you become a zombie. So this tells us that Rick and his team aren't the only ones who know that this is the outcome. Now, this is just logical, right? I mean, we would have to have people in Negan's savior group who died of natural causes, died of a heart attack, died of old age, whatever the case may be, and then they reanimated. So somewhere along the line, it would have made sense that he would just learn how it is that everybody's infected. But what he also says is that if a person is bitten or infected by a zombie, regardless of how small the wound is, the fever will overtake their body, it'll burn out their immune system, it'll kill them, and then they'll reanimate. So he says, we're going to use this to our advantage. We're not just going to go in there with blunt instruments beating them over the head. We're going to use this to our advantage. And if we cannot kill them you know, through conventional means, then we're gonna kill them in a war of attrition. Now, for those of you guys who don't know, a war of attrition is really just a war against overwhelming odds. And wars of attrition are won in a multitude of ways, really in multiple ways at once. A war of attrition, for example, is like a war against zombies, where there's just, you know, the zombies just keep coming in. They're just relentless. They just wear you down. But wars of attrition are won when the defending side usually runs out of resources, or they run out of ammunition, or they run out of people to fight. But it's where you're just constantly bombarded with an enemy force until you just can't fight anymore. And that's what Negan says. Negan says, we're going to take our weapons and we're going to cover them in zombie. We're going to cover them in zombie flesh, or we're going to cover them in zombie blood, so that all we have to do is run up on any one of Rick's guys in the hilltop, and we can just scratch them. All we have to do is just cut them and they will become infected. The fever will take over, and it's just, you know, clear sailing from there. And that's actually extremely smart. That's one of the smartest things he could do, because, you know, all it would take is for him to run in with Lucille, you know, run into a group of people and just start swinging. And because Lucille is covered in barbed wire, the barbed wire is going to scratch people. But with the barbed wire covered in zombie blood, it'll turn them all into zombies. And then from there, it's Rick fighting a battle on two fronts, fighting against those who are turning into zombies and fighting against Negan. Not only that, it'll be people diverting resources to those who are dying, because Negan knows that Rick is a caring individual at his core. And so where Rick basically says, hey, look, we've got a day to get all these guys out of here, we learn that Negan and his forces intend to attack at sundown. And so this really just eliminates the time frame that Rick has. Now from here, this is really just kind of a lot of fast-paced action and not a whole lot in the realm of discussion. There is some discussion here and there, but it really doesn't add anything to the discussion that we've already had when it comes to the characters so far. And so in the end, we basically join some of the scouts who are overlooking the wall with the arrival of Negan. Now, the funny thing is that one of the guys, you know, when Negan says, I want Rick Grimes, you know, one of the guys says, I have no idea who you're talking about, get out of here, keeps telling Negan to leave. Negan has one of his guys just shoot the dude right off the bat. And this is Kirkman telling us, Negan's not messing around. Negan's not screwing around here. He's not playing games. This is not Negan's normal funny where he takes jives kind of scenario. This is him, brass taxes, down to business. He's not goofing off. And so again, he says, look, Rick, if you do not come out here, I'm going to tear this wall down and I'm going to kill you all. And Rick still does not answer him. And so in the end, he has one of his guys drive one of their cargo trucks through the wall, and then they all start invading. Now from here, of course, Rick and his forces begin to open fire, but it's absolute pandemonium. You have the Saviors riding in, you have Rick and his forces trying to hold them off. I mean, it's absolutely insane, the amount of carnage that's going on here. Not only that, you still have Negan with his zombie-infected Lucille just cutting through, you know, damaging people left and right. But eventually he's able to get around where it is that Rick and his forces are, get behind them, and he tells Dwight, shoot Rick Grimes. Now, this puts Dwight in a rough situation, because Dwight, you know, is supposed to have covered his arrows in muck, supposed to have covered his arrows in zombie blood. And so if he shoots Rick Grimes, it'll turn him into a zombie. And that's exactly what Dwight does. Dwight shoots Rick Grimes with an infected arrow, and Negan relishes in the celebration, because he says, now Rick Grimes is infected. Rick Grimes is going to become a zombie. And he says, we essentially have won this war. At this point, all we have to do is wait them out. And so from here, we also learn that not only does Negan have this major force, but Negan also has contingency forces. Because remember, we talked about that in the last video. We talked about how Negan had forces designed for the purpose of coming in as a secondary attack, you know, being able to hold off long enough to where when they were called in, they'd be reserves and they would be able to mop up whoever was left. But we also have Harlan, and we have Eugene, and we have those individuals who have escaped from the Saviors who are trying to make their way back to the hilltop. But along the way, they basically run into some of these forces of Negan. Now they are able to take them out. Of course, again, this is really just Eugene playing the tough guy again, saying, you need to follow my lead if you want to make it out of this alive. But then jumping back to Rick Grimes, it's absolute panic here. Now also keep in mind, it's nighttime at this point, which means because there is no electricity here, they're really just fighting in almost pitch black and whatever the light, you know, whatever light the stars offer. That's it. They really have nothing else to go with here. And so while I wouldn't go as far as to say they're fighting each other as much as they're fighting Negan's forces, the goal is that Negan says, look, we've got him in a bad situation. One, we've virtually killed Rick Grimes. Two, their forces are panicking and they're scattered. Rick can't give them directions. And three, all we have to do is stay one step ahead. All we have to do is basically take refuge here, corner them, and then we'll win. And that's what Negan does. He ends up following them once Rick and his forces run into hiding, but then we learn that Negan just stepped right into a trap. They're basically met with headlights everywhere and everyone opens fire. What a beastly ass thing. It's so cool. I can't wait to see something like this in the show. Now, Negan, of course, keeps his head. Negan keeps a level head. A lot of his guys panic, but Negan says, get out of here, run. Like we will reforce, run away, live to fight another day. And that's what he says. So they all end up bailing out and they essentially just kind of take refuge in the surrounding woods. Now, the following morning, this is really just trying to pick up on everything that's going on. We, of course, have Jesus saying, hey, look, we scoured the field of those individuals that we killed that were part of the Saviors, and we've learned that they coated their weapons in zombie blood. Now, this is Rick Grimes learning that he's been penetrated with an arrow infected with zombie blood. And so this is, oh my God, he's going to die. This is really Rick Grimes coming to this, but it's also the idea that a multitude of other people in his forces from the kingdom, from the hilltop, from the Alexandria safe zone, they've also been infected as well. And so they're all essentially just dying. And again, Negan relishes in this, in this last tidbit of a conversation with Dwight, he says, hey man, we basically won. Like, we could do nothing. I mean, we're camping out here in the woods, but the reason why we're here is because we don't have to worry about Rick Grimes. Rick Grimes is going to die. He's going to become a zombie. He's infected, and that's the end of it for him. And so again, this is really just a lot of the people in the area beginning to succumb to the fever, some of whom are turning really fast, some of whom aren't turning as fast as others, and it's putting those individuals down. But then we pick up 12 hours later, and this is the kicker. We pick up 12 hours later, and we learn that Rick Grimes is not infected. That it seems in, his position in working for Negan, that Dwight had shot Rick Grimes with a clean arrow. And the result is that the only fever that Rick Grimes was experiencing was the fever of an injury. But it doesn't change the fact that so many of their forces are dead. Now, the kicker about this is him basically saying Negan is using what's equivalent to chemical warfare in the zombie apocalypse, because that's really what it is. Chemical warfare is really just designed as using, biological chemicals or using biological warfare in a way that can render the enemy inert. It can basically defeat them. It's chemical warfare that can be used through torture, any number of means, but using zombie blood as a weapon against normal people amounts to chemical warfare. I really can't think, or I guess maybe biological warfare, but it's non-conventional warfare. It works, but it's still something that Rick Grimes says, this is insane. We can't let this kind of thing happen. And where Negan had expected Rick to be dead, it ends up rallying everybody under Rick's side, not necessarily Negan's forces, but it rallies Rick forces under his side more so than they were before, because they see just how extreme, the lengths that Negan's willing to go to. Now, the cool thing about this is, of course, because of the fact that Negan believes that Rick is dead, he begins calling people out. He shows back up and he says, look, you guys are screwed. Your leader's gone. You guys are in shambles. Alexandria's safe zone's torn to pieces. You've got a school bus in front of the entrance, but that's never going to hold. He's like, so, you give up now. If you give up now, everything can go back to the way it was before. We'll be cool. But then Rick shows up. And this is where things get amazing, because this is when we learn the fate of Negan. So what happens is the two of them begin engaging in a conversation. And that's the coolest thing about this, because we would have sat down and we would have thought, why wouldn't they just talk this out before? Because they're both going for the same thing. We talked about that in the last video. We talked about how Negan was wanting to reinstate society. He was wanting to rebuild. Rick Grimes was wanting to do the exact same thing. They were just going about it two different ways. But Rick Grimes says, hey, look, man, we're both trying to rebuild here. Like, we're both trying to recreate society. And he says, I have a proposition for you. We'll set up a bartering system. All right. We'll go to you if we need supplies, and we'll trade for those supplies. We'll give you what you need so we can get what we need. It's the most logical system to have. It's the thing that makes the most sense, especially considering that the forces of Negan are so capable, but Rick Grimes has a lot of the supplies and the resources that Negan needs. And so Negan listens, he's actually enamored by this. He's enamored by the idea of the two of them rebuilding society. It's such a cool idea for him, because Negan is like, yes, like we can rebuild, and so when Rick is like, hey man, like, are you starting to get the bigger picture? Are you realizing that we can really, rebuild things? He and Negan finally come together. They finally come to the realization of what can happen. And then Rick slices his throat. He cuts his throat, son. I read this and I was like, holy shit. But with that said, guys, we're going to bring this video to an end. I'm just messing around. We're not going to do that. We still have a little bit left. So this whole thing of Rick slicing the throat of Negan, God, it was so badass. It really just leads to a fight between the two. Now, this is Kirkman telling us, like, when it comes down to it, when it comes past all the jokes, Negan is a badass, because he's holding his throat with one hand and beating the hell out of Rick Grimes with the other. And it is, it's so cool. Now, at the same time, you also have, the forces of Negan who are trying to go against the forces of Rick. And initially, it seems like it's kind of like a battle in the nth degree. It's a battle in every direction. Of course, you have, Negan fighting off as best he can, but in the the midst of going against Rick, the blood loss gets the better of him, and Negan ends up passing out. Now from here, we have Dwight basically pick up in his place. Dwight, takes Lucille, he picks up Lucille, he takes the bat, and he says, everyone stand down. Like, Negan has fallen. We are not living under Negan's direction anymore. He's like, you're under my direction now. You're under my control. Now, where it would seem like Dwight is going to be this, guy who's just as ruthless as Negan, it's not that way. Instead, he says, we're going to lead into a better tomorrow. We're going to lead into a better future. Now, the other half of this is with Dr. Carson tending to Rick Grimes. Rick says, don't worry about me. All I have is a broken leg. We can set that, here in a little while and it'll be fine. He says, you need to save Negan's life. Rick saves Negan's life. And it's a really cool moment because in truth, this is where Negan really gets cool when it comes to The Walking Dead, is when you start to learn more about him on a very personal level. Now from here, we basically pick up with Rick recovering in the hospital. We pick up with him picking up, or I guess, recovering from his broken leg. One of the big debates here between Rick and his family, or I guess, between Carl and Andrea, and even Maggie herself, is that not all of them agree with Rick's decision. But Rick says, yes, we could have killed Negan, but the issue is we would have been just like him. But he says, we're not like Negan, we're not like the saviors. We save people if we can. We don't kill those who disagree with us or who would work against us. We can cast them out, we can try to reason with them, but we don't kill them. And so ultimately we have Rick basically picking up with a conversation with Negan, where he sits down with him and he says, look, man, you're going to be a prisoner here. We're going to keep you as a prisoner. You are going to stay rotting in jail for the rest of your life until the day you die. Now, this has a lot of implications. This has implications that Rick expects everything to go as smoothly as it can, and he expects to rebuild. The problem with this is that there is an enemy out there. There's an enemy out there that's been there the entire time. There's an enemy out there that's been watching this entire event unfold. And the reason why Rick didn't know about them is because Rick couldn't see them. With that being said, we're gonna bring this video to an end, and next week, hopefully I think I'm gonna try the first volume. Next week, we're gonna get into the introduction of the Whisperers. Whew, worse than Negan. Those guys are rough. It is, they're really, really bad. They're cool. They're probably the coolest thing to come out of The Walking Dead, probably since Negan, but yeah, like they're super cool. Anyway, if you're new here to Comics Explained, make sure you guys hit the subscribe button and become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoyed this video, drop a like, hit that like button, and leave a comment down below. Let me know if you guys are interested in seeing the Whisperer War. And I will catch you all later. Peace.